the hour has arrived. My name is Larry Greenwood. It's my honor to moderate this panel. This panel is, this is April 10th, Tuesday. This is panel 2314, USA at the Global Leadership Table. I guess I'm saying that because this is being recorded and therefore it can be marked. We have, let's see, we'll be taking questions. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way, just by cards, because I haven't been able to figure out how to read the app yet. And so there'll be folks in both aisles here with cards for questions. So if you have questions, please signal to one of the folks there for the cards. Let's see. Please silence your phones. If you're a student, mark on the card the question that you're a student, so we'll get to you first. I think that's it for the housekeeping items. Let me proceed to the more interesting part. Let me introduce our three great speakers and then start having them talk. So starting from my left, we have Susie Snyder, who is the Nuclear Disarmament Program Manager at the Don't Bank on the Bomb. That's the name of the institution, the organization, right?
That's actually a project that we have. The institution is called PAX.
Oh, PAX, sorry. And is, by the name of it, obviously works on nuclear disarmament issues. And Susie is from New York, but is living in the Netherlands. And so I think, along with our friend who actually came in from the Philippines, there's probably one of the longest journeys to get to the conference. So thanks, Susie, for coming. Next is Henry Now. Henry is a professor of political science and international relations at George Washington University. He is obviously both an academic as well as a practitioner. He served in the Reagan administration, and he's also the author of a number of books. Most recently, a book called Conservative Internationalism. Did I get that right? And which is, by the way, which I've read, and it's a great book. So please buy it. It's probably for sale out there in the lobby. And then to his left, someone who needs no introduction in this auditorium and in this state, Senator Timothy Worth, who is, of course, had a long history. Actually, I didn't even realize that you started in the Lyndon Johnson administration at the White House, so goes back a few years. And has served in a number of administrations, including when I was in the State Department. Mr. Worth was our Undersecretary for Global Affairs, the first Undersecretary for Global Affairs in the United States. And of course, served as representative here and as well as a senator. So with those introductions, let's start the discussion. U.S. At the Global Leadership Table. Let me ask Professor Now to start off.
Thank you. Is that on? Yeah. Thank you, Larry. It's a great privilege and honor to be on this panel with these colleagues and all of the service that they have given to the country, particularly Ambassador Worth. I'm going to set sort of a broad table for discussing U.S. global leadership at the table by giving a little bit of historical perspective. Oops, I'm sorry. There we go. Wow, these things are sensitive. Yeah. Oh, I forgot my punchline. I was going to say we're the only thing standing in the way between you and the jazz festival. So we better be on our toes. Look, my main point is that America, in some sense, has been on the front line and has been at the global leadership table from the very beginning. And that was true in the 1790s politically. We were doing something in America that had never been tried before. We were trying to build a republic, trying to construct a republic of self-government with the idea, certainly under the terms of the Declaration, that eventually all would be able to participate. And we were going to do that without any of the traditional institutions of authority that had held people together in the world at that time and in the past. What do I mean by that? We were going to do it without a monarchy. We were going to do it without a monarch, and that monarch was very important in the evolution of republicanism in Britain, for example, as well as in Holland. We were going to do it without a monarch. We were going to do it without a state church. And the church, too, was an important institution of authority in England and in other places in Europe in terms of holding the people together while they were loosening the reins on the aristocratic monarchic governments that existed at the time. We were going to do it without a state church. And to some extent, we were going to do it without even a common history. because most of the colonies had related directly to England rather than to one another. We were going to put together a system of government never tried before by this large a country in which the people were going to make the decisions as time went on. Now, I'm not trying to glamorize that early republic. It had a lot of problems. But it was a challenge to the dominant governmental system of the day. And by the way, it was noticed in Europe from the very beginning. European monarchs didn't like it. I have a great quote, but it's in my computer and takes too much time to try to take it out. If you're interested, get in touch with me, from Prince Metternich. Now, he was the Austrian aristocrat who was very prominent in the mid-19th century, in which he said, by golly, if that country succeeds now, this is in the late 1840s when we were getting some revolutions in Europe and the monarchs were getting a little worried about that. He says, if that country succeeds, we're toast. Now, he didn't say that, but he basically meant that. And John Quincy Adams wrote in a number of his letters from foreign capitals during the early 1800s how the monarchs were watching this experiment and were nervous about this experiment. So, in that sense, America was at the global leadership level. Ideologically, we were doing something. We almost failed, by the way. Obviously, the Civil War, we came very close to that. But somehow or other, we succeeded. Now, in the 20th century, power caught up with our purpose. We were weak, obviously, and for most of the 19th century, didn't play a significant role in the global system. But by the end of the 19th century, we began to assume we had more power, and we began to assume a more active role at the world table. Now, in my judgment, we did that kind of reluctantly. We came to the table reluctantly. You know, we stayed out of World War I until very late. We stayed out of World War II until very late. We went home in the 20s and 30s. We kind of spurned that leadership role in the 20s and 30s. So it's hard for me to accept the argument that we were aggressive and imperialist and we couldn't wait to get into the world stage and use our powers. It was just the opposite. After World War II, I think we recognized we just had to use our power. We just had to stay in the game. And that was a period of great innovation in terms of American foreign policy, and for all practical purposes, great success. I mean, the Cold War, I think, marks a period in which the United States put its shoulder to the wheel, pursued a foreign policy in which we understood that we had to, it was important for us to stand for who we were, namely a democratic republic, and we were trying to urge and encourage and nurture others in that direction, most particularly our defeated adversaries, Germany and Japan, that we were going to have to put our muscle to the, our shoulder to the wheel, let me get the right analogy here, shoulder to the wheel in order to do that. That is, we couldn't do it by withdrawing. We were going to have to commit forces to an outside theater, in the case of Europe, that we had never done before. Truman planted that flag, you could say, for freedom in Europe in the late 1940s. And we nurtured in one country after another, especially in Europe and Asia now, not in other parts of the world, but in Europe and Asia, we nurtured democracy, such that by the time the Cold War ended, democracy was prevalent throughout the western part of the world. All of the major industrialized countries were democracies. Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, Japan was a functioning democracy. Taiwan and South Korea still depended heavily on military governments until the late 1980s, but they were quickly to move in a democratic direction. And once the Cold War ended, once we dealt with the major confrontation between freedom and communism in Europe and Asia, then authoritarian governments fell all over the world, including some of those that we had supported during the Cold War, because we found out we couldn't support democracy everywhere at once. You had to set priorities. But at the end of the Cold War, some 63 countries became democratic. We had created, by the end of the 1900s, a better world, a much better world, all right, because all the major powers were, in fact, republics, such as we had started, you could say, in the late 1700s. Now, today, in the world we occupy at the moment, I would argue that the United States is at that pivot point where we don't have to exercise as much leadership in the world as we did before. We pursued a strategy that deliberately increased the power and the prosperity of other countries. First, our adversaries, and then one country after the other. We helped them to actually become more powerful. We were happy to see our power decline, which it has done steadily since 1945. And we now live in a world in which we don't have the kind of leverage and power that we had in the early, but we don't need it, because the world, at least the democratic world, is a pretty safe place for us. Democratic countries don't threaten each other militarily. They don't engage in threats that involve military means. That's a world in which we can be a lot more comfortable. Now, we still face challenges. Obviously, we face the terrorist challenge, which hit us in the early 2000s. And we potentially today face growing challenges from, once again, authoritarian powers who fear our kind of republican government. I'm thinking in particular of Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. So we have some problems. But my final point is that I hope as we come to the leadership table today, we recognize that we ought to, and we should expect, we ought to encourage and we should expect our allies to do more. We should be willing to let that happen, because we're going to lose some control in this process, some influence. But they are wealthy, prosperous, they can do more. I like what President Trump did when he went to Europe last year, because he made the allies aware of the fact that we're going to expect you to do more. And if you don't, we may not be there the next time you really need us. So they can do a lot more. On the other hand, we still have to be prima inter pares. That is, I think we need to be at the table. We need to have the vision that our primary concerns are to defend and potentially then expand this Republican world, which is safer and better, not just for ourselves, but for lots of other people. And that we have to cope with Russia and China in that process, with these two major rogue states, if you want to call them that, Iran and North Korea, and then ultimately, of course, with terrorism. But we need the help of others, and we should expect it. And I hope that in the future we can return to a somewhat less aggressive leadership role, because we've been so successful. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm reminded that 15 years ago, many of you were here. I've done about 20 World Affairs Conference sessions. 15 years ago, the dominant topic of conversation was Iraq and the invasion of Iraq by the United States of America. At which point we said to the world that what we were going to do is to go in with military force, and we're going to change the government in Iraq, and that in turn was going to have a very benign influence in the rest of the Middle East. It's going to convince many governments to move toward democratic institutions. We're going to significantly shift the way in which the world did its business in the Middle East, and that we would be the overseer of that through a growing military presence. I think in retrospect, it's fair to say that while that sounded good if you said it fast enough, the result was one of the great disasters of American foreign policy. And what happened was that we, by going into Iraq and then leaving Iraq in various pieces, opened up the door to Al-Qaeda and all kinds of forces of terrorism, lost Iraq as a buffer against Iran, did nothing about the traditional historic battles between the political sides of Islam, the Shia and the Sunni, essentially political battles, not religious battles, as the Pope has said, they are political battles. And the United States has, it seems to me, been at sea in terms of our foreign policy ever since. It's very hard for me to find what the guiding principles are, for U.S. foreign policy and for U.S. engagement. We can see the challenges from what I think I'm a little less benign than you are about the role of the United States. I think it's absolutely imperative that the United States play a very aggressive role, not necessarily a totally military role, but a role in which we are deeply involved politically, we're deeply involved economically, we're deeply involved in supporting human rights, we're deeply involved in supporting international institutions of governance, we're deeply involved in international environmental issues, we're deeply involved in issues related to the empowerment of women. That set of goals or that set of involvements are not as broadly shared as we might hope they would be. And in fact, much of the world is dropped. I would say that that was a package that defines what a democracy ought to be. And I think we'd probably all agree with that. Those are elements that are very, very important for defining what a democracy ought to be. It's not just going in with military force and getting people to sit down and at the ballot box, but it's developing a whole range of institutions that are absolutely imperative for the survival of democratic values. Over the last 15 years, I think we're beginning to see a really significant erosion of democratic values around the world. I know we just most recently in the headlines see what's been going on with Poland and going on with Hungary. You know, real challenges to the governments of two states that at the time of the end of the Cold War were a couple of the strongest advocates for democratic institutions, and they have fallen off of that particular role. The revolution in the Middle East, the largest country of all was Egypt. Egypt was trying to move through a transition to democracy, very complicated, has now fallen back into becoming a very militaristic power. If we look at, and the largest and most important country in the Middle East, if we look at what's happening in the Philippines, what's happening in many, many other places around the world, the paramount's of democratic institutions, and by that I mean this whole fabric of institutions that make up the democratic world in the West that we all have come to, I think, respect and know, is eroding much more rapidly than we, I think, would think it should. And the United States is not helping that at all. The way in which this administration, for example, has treated the #1 mechanism for our engagement around the world, our State Department, which has been attacked, eroded, best people retired and resigned, you know, and it's no longer a respected institution, and the rest of the world looks at this and say, well, what are you all really doing? If you look at the United Nations, you know, we have taken a role as if the United Nations is there for military purposes rather than for the long kind of patience that is necessary to do any of the sort of diplomacy that has to be done at the United Nations and can only be done there. You know, we're missing, it seems to me, a lot of opportunities on that front. In the economic sphere, we've talked about America first and moved away from the fabric of international agreements that had really held much of the world together economically, sometimes not as equitably as should be, but certainly the World Trade Organization and the international financial institutions have been overall very benign in terms of development around the world and helping with opportunities for people. The environment sticks out as a particular sore point. We were the people that led the battle leading up to the climate conference in Paris in 2015. A remarkable gathering and a remarkable focus on a shared problem and on a set of shared strategies for reaching that problem. One of the administration's first steps was to pull the rug out from underneath that. We're now the only country in the world that is not a member of the Paris Agreement. I mean, it's pretty astonishing when we look at the long-term threats to the world and think about the threat to the environment. So where do we go from here? I mean, that's going to be a long, hard slog, it seems to me, to work to rebuild the institutions that we had worked for a long period of time since the Second World War, that we had worked for such a long period of time to build and to nurture and develop, not only in the United States, but around the world. It's going to take a long time to rebuild the trade agreements and to rebuild the kind of trust that's necessary. It's going to take a long time to rebuild the environmental commitments, the measurement tools, the very, very complicated negotiations that went into that happening. It's going to take a long time to rebuild a sense of leadership from the United States of America. So how do we do that? Well, I think the way we recognize that what happened, was a political act. It was a political act by the United States in the election of 2016, which changed the world in a way that I think we are still beginning to try to understand, but in a much more dramatic way than anybody expected. And it seems to me there's an old expression, you fight fire with fire. I mean, this is an electoral process, and what we do between now and November 2018, how well we handle our commitment to, trying to return this country to a set of democratic commitments and democratic institutions and a democratic government is going to be extremely important. If we don't do that, it's going to be very hard for us internationally to assume the role that I think all of us would like to see the United States share. Obviously, I was a working politician. I really believe in the ballot box, and I believe in helping to build the institutions that are necessary to make the ballot box work. It doesn't work by itself. It works because you do all of the steps that have to be taken to build the base and to strengthen the fabric of that kind of belief. That's now eroding around the world. We have to be very careful about this because I think that slippage is very dangerous for us as a country and is very dangerous long-term for the world.
So when we got up here today, Larry over here asked us in which order we wanted to speak. And me being kind of new to this conference and, sitting in the presence of pretty impressive people, said, I'll go last. That's not the first mistake I've made. Wow, okay. So I'm just gonna start with wow. This is great. I'm really excited to be here. And this is a really interesting topic because I carry a US passport, but I haven't lived in the US in about 15 years. So I have a really different perspective on the US at the global leadership table, and I do a lot of work in different UN buildings. And as a civil society member, so I'm not a government, but I'm talking to governments all the time. I'm an American, but not living in the US, so I have this kind of awkward perspective. And so let me share a little bit of my awkward perspective with you. And after these very clear and excellent opening comments, maybe we can help, parse our way through my own personal awkwardness. So like from the European perspective, we look at the US, or I look at the US, and I see, well, the US was at one time a very important leader on issues of norms, of values, of institutions. We wouldn't have had the League of Nations, the forebear of the United Nations, if it weren't for the US pushing hard, demanding, sometimes backing up those diplomatic efforts with, the big stick. But we wouldn't be kind of in this situation where we have these international institutions that are norms and values based without the US. And now I consistently see the US actively undermining those same institutions. And that's very hard. And 15 years ago, and I'm so glad that you mentioned this 15 years ago because it popped into my head too. 15 years ago, there was a split. And I remember doing some work around the Security Council at the time. There was this tremendous split in the UN Security Council amongst the permanent 5 members about Iraq, about whether to allow inspections to continue, to let Hans Blix do his job, or to go in with force. And it was a split that is still not fully healed. And it was, I remember, when I was younger and people were talking about, protesting French nuclear testing, people said, don't eat French cheese, don't buy French wine. And then in 2003, the French were opposed to US military intervention. It was like, go eat French cheese, go buy French wine. And so you have these splits and these changes. But that split was more than the Security Council. That split also impacted NATO in a very big way. Another major international institution that would not have existed without the Washington Treaty that established it at US leadership. And that split is not fully healed 15 years later. And the intervention in Afghanistan gave some space for some of that split to come back, but there are still substantive arguments about what norms and values are we projecting that undercurrent debates at NATO in the Security Council. Some of the looking ahead towards leadership, and I keep things in a post-Cold War mentality because that's my reality. I'm a post-Cold War kid, right? And so I look back to pre-Cold War, and it's important to understand to the best of my ability what happened. But my life is after that, you know, and so it's different. And I see now this return to what was described at that, you know, in the Cold War, this return to autocratic governments, this turn away from human rights, this turn away from democratic values, and it's been unleashed. And the acceptance and acceptability of that has been unleashed by the US. So again, from a European perspective, I see kind of, we have many political parties, but we can still kind of categorize in two camps, you know, your left wing, your right wing. And I mean, many, like there are 28 political parties on last year's Dutch national election. Like the ballot was bigger than the table. But left wing, right wing, and there's a left wing feeling about the US leadership at the global table that it's like, well, the US doesn't have any authority anymore. The US doesn't have any legitimacy anymore. Look at what is happening within US borders. How dare they try to tell us what to do when they can't get their own house in order? And on the other hand, there's this right-wing fervor that has been unleashed, that it's now okay to eradicate the rights of women over bodily autonomy. Sure, no problem. No worries, you half of the population, you don't need to have autonomy over your own body. It's okay. It's okay to jail reporters. They're fake news anyway. They're not real. They can go to prison. That's not actually happening. That's fake news. So I wonder, you know, if the U.S. at the global leadership table, when the U.S., it depends on what kind of shape is the U.S. in, and that's a question that I ask from my, like I said, relatively awkward perspective. Is the U.S. coming to the global leadership table to lead on values-based interventions that are rooted in the deep democratic values of history that created was it the 63 democratic countries that helped make that happen at the end of the Cold War? Or is the U.S. coming to the global leadership table in a way to unleash the unthinkable? And I don't know. I'm not gonna say that I know. What I do wonder is there going to be an honest conversation about what that table looks like, and whether that leadership table that has been is the leadership table that will be in the coming years? Because what do you bring to the table? And everybody knows in good negotiations, and as folks know very well, in negotiations, you have to come with your initial position and a pocket full of stuff you're willing to give. You don't give that pocket full of stuff immediately, but you have to have something. And I'm worried that there's not much in the US pocket to give right now. And so I don't know if there's the energy for leadership, and maybe that leadership needs to come from somewhere else. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, all three. Let me ask first if any of the speakers have something to react to. And actually, let me, rather than do that, let me ask more specifically a question to Henry. So you said that the U.S. still needs to be at the table to, I think you said, to defend and even expand Republican, the democratic values. At the same time, you also mentioned that there was a need to scale, that we don't need to be as active as we have in the past. And I'm wondering, in looking at that table, What do you see in terms of relative roles of a bilateral approach versus multilateral? We have President Trump has been very firm on this move to the bilateral versus multilateral. I just wanted to get your reactions to that, particularly since it seems to relate to both what Tim and Susie mentioned.
If you have to act unilaterally, and sometimes in the real world you do, or you have to act minilaterally, that is with a coalition of the willing, if you will, not all of your allies, you better act in a way that eventually restores consensus at the multilateral level. Unilateral action in itself is not bad. You sometimes have to do that to protect yourself and to protect your allies. There was the big split that Susie talks about in 2003. I'd like to encourage students to study that because it's very complicated. The United States had to put forces, large forces, into the Gulf in order to get the inspectors back into Iraq. Now, don't forget that. It took force in the diplomacy to get the inspectors back into Iraq. Now was the question of how long do you wait for the inspectors to do their job? Well, the Europeans said, oh, give them a lot of time because they didn't have many forces on the ground. We were there. 90% of the forces were American forces. Now, the summer is a very hard time, a period in which to fight and so on. So we were under pressure. Our military leaders were under pressure. Are we going in this year or not? We might have been able to postpone it for another year. We could have done a better job, it seems to me, in trying to bring especially the Germans on board. I should know, most importantly, the French. I mean, if we'd succeeded with the French, then I think the Germans would have joined us. It was costly to do it the way we did it. But don't forget, there was a general consensus in the United States. We had had a significant debate and congressional vote in the fall of 2002, and the country was ready to go to war. Now, we messed up the war, and we can go into that. I'm afraid Iraq has had the kind of effect on our thinking and on our expectations that Vietnam had. And what as bad as Vietnam might be, there is a panel tomorrow on Vietnam, or might have been, it shouldn't cloud the record, the larger record that the United States had during the Cold War period. We won the Cold War was a very successful period, even with Vietnam. So I kind of want to say, look, don't overlook the successes that we are achieving over this question of Iraq. Ambassador Worth, I know, started with that comment. It is important, but it is not that important. We live in a world now that is much better. For that reason, I think the United States wants to become I think both parties, Democratic and Republican, want the United States to become a somewhat more normal country at the global leadership table. There was a move towards that in the 1990s. Even George W. Bush campaigned for a more humble foreign policy. Then, of course, we got hit by 9/11, and believe me, we were scared. You were scared. I was scared. All right, we knew we had to do something in Afghanistan. After all, they attacked us. You can't just let them go. And then there was the debate about whether or not there was a link to Saddam Hussein. That can be debated one way or the other, but there was a consensus to do something about Saddam Hussein. Now, I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that don't let that cloud over everything. After 9/11 and after 2003, both the Bush administration and especially the Obama administration began to pull back. And Obama, by the way, wanted to reduce our leadership role in the world. He was very explicit about that. He still wanted to stand for certain values and norms, and that was good, but you can't really do that unless you have some military capability to stand behind it. But he wanted to reduce our involvement, and he said he wasn't going to get us in. He was elected to end wars, not to start new ones. He didn't intervene in Syria. I think Trump has got some of the same instincts, so I don't know why we're so divided on this question. Trump also wants to try to deal with the challenges we face, and we can't walk away from them, and we are a big player at the table. He wants to deal with them in a way that will not get us entangled in another major war in the Middle East. So in further comments, I can comment. I mean, I think Trump has done some things, some very good things in Europe and in Asia. He now faces some very serious challenges in the Middle East. And if you can pull that off, if some way or other we can protect our interests in the Middle East without getting involved in another Iraq or Afghanistan, I will ultimately give him extremely high marks.
Thank you. Do any of the other speakers have thoughts on, particularly on this issue of multilateral versus bilateral? I know Senator Worth, obviously, you spent most of your career, at least the State Department, on the multilateral side, but also, of course, to achieve the agenda that you set out, for example, on environment, human rights, women, bilateral engagement is also very important as well. So any thoughts on kind of that balance?
Well, again, I would say the importance of the United States, you know, this is not a unipolar world, but we are incredibly important and remain extremely important even as we are withdrawing and pulling back what we ought to be doing. You know, the examples are legion of the opportunities that we are missing. You know, I thought, Susie, you might say something about the nuclear world. I mean, here we are, your institution says something about nuclear in it. I mean, here we are beginning to think about, quote, modernizing, unquote, our nuclear weapons capability at the cost of a modest $1 trillion. For what purpose? Who is the enemy? How would you possibly use and think about nuclear weapons? We were on a path to reduce nuclear weaponry around the world, and now we're opening the door to doing just the opposite. That impresses me as unilateralism at its very worst, where we are exercising the muscle that we have and doing it not in a benign fashion whatsoever. There are lots of places we can be benign about what we do, but there are a lot of them that I think that have been unleashed in the last year that I think are really dangerous for the world and ultimately are going to be very dangerous for us in the United States of America, but I've already made that point. I'd finally just suggest also, I don't think that there was the kind of consensus that you're suggesting about Iraq when we made that decision in 2003. What astonishes me is the delinquency of some people who really should have known better, you know, the Colin Powells and the Brent Scowcrofts and so on, you know, and Hillary. I mean, the inspectors were on the ground. They were saying over and over and over again that there is no sign of nuclear materials. There are no sign of a nuclear weapons plant. They were attempting to complete, this was not into the future. If they'd had a matter of weeks more to complete that, they would have been all over Iraq and been able to say that didn't exist. The stampede that occurred, the mentality of the stampede that occurred, there was one democratic resolution led by Robert Byrd and Teddy Kennedy, you know, which got 23 or 28 votes, I think, saying, don't do this now, wait until the inspectors are completed. But we went in anyway, and I think the results of that were you know, catastrophic. I think that it's the biggest mistake we've made in the time that any of us has been alive. But anyway, it was that was a failure of leadership domestically as well, who our leaders were and what they were willing to stand up to. Let's hope today we've got some leadership that has a little more steel in its backbone, going to be necessary to stand up to some of the more egregious things that we can guarantee are going to continue between now and November.
Thank you. We have a number of questions from students, so thank you very much for that, and keep those questions from students coming as well as the rest of you. Here's a very specific question about a specific issue, and that is, would it be catastrophic if the U.S. were to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal? Very topical country.
Yes. I'm going to jump in on that because I do work on nuclear weapons. Like, I live and breathe that stuff, which, I mean, not actually nuclear weapons because that would kill me. Right? That would, you know, I don't believe in catastrophic humanitarian consequences of my soul that way, but nuclear weapons is the bulk of my work. So, yeah, so if the U.S. pulled out of the Iran deal next month, that would be horrifying. Think about the signal that would send. I mean, here you have the most intensive inspection regime that has ever been put in place and agreed to through diplomatic negotiations. The most intensive regime ever to make sure a country does not get nuclear weapons. because nuclear weapons are bad. Nobody should have nuclear weapons. They're bad. And to make sure that a country doesn't get them. And if the US pulls out of that deal, they are worthless in terms of being able to uphold an agreement. Like, a deal maker is not a deal breaker. And you can't walk away from something, especially when there have been such intense efforts from dedicated, brilliant individuals from the State Department, dedicated and brilliant individuals from the European Union, to make sure that there is no nuclear weapon coming out of Iran. Like, that deal is a damn good deal. There's no way another deal like that could happen now. If the US walked away from that, it's gonna be really embarrassing. And it means that there's absolutely zero leverage when it comes to doing any sort of deal with North Korea. So just delegitimize yourself completely if you want to walk away. And that's not a good, that's a little bit more than just my simple yes, but I'm passionate about this, as you can tell. Please encourage your elected officials to make sure the US doesn't walk out of that deal, because that would be a terrible, terrible thing for all of us.
What do you think, Andrew?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask. No, we actually had a panel on Iran just a couple hours ago. And of course, I don't agree that the nuclear agreement is a good agreement. I don't agree with, I hope that Trump stays in the agreement, because I really think at the moment it doesn't matter. The real problem is Iran and its behavior in the region, which of course Obama completely separated from the agreement. His view was that if you got the agreement, you would change Iranian behavior. Well, so far it hasn't worked. Iranian behavior has gotten more aggressive, and now we're facing aggressions on the part of Iranian groups, by the way, IRGC in Syria, that the Israelis are reacting to. The agreement at best slows the momentum of the Iranian nuclear agreement. It by no means denuclearizes Iran. And we have other problems to worry about, like missiles and conventional arms, because Iran is aggressively pursuing its power in the region. I mean, Trump has so far indicated he's taking a somewhat different tack, which is to say that the focus should be Iranian behavior, not the nuclear agreement. Now, if he walks out of the nuclear agreement, he's going to make the nuclear agreement again the focus of the debate. I mean, let the agreement go, I would say. Keep pressing, by the way, for revisions of the agreement, and work quietly with the Europeans to see if we can't get some agreement on that to keep the pressure on the Iranians. Have the IAEA test the so-called unprecedented intrusive inspection procedures, because they haven't tested them. They haven't asked for a single visit to a military site since the agreement went into effect. They should. If this thing is that good, if this agreement's that good, if these verification procedures are good, let's find out. But the big thing is to focus on the behavior of Iran, and there Trump is trying, it's a long shot, but he's trying, as I understand it, to put together a coalition that could, in fact, counter Iranian aggression in the region, or begin to push back against Iranian aggression in the region. That would be a coalition led by Saudi Arabia and maybe Egypt and the other Gulf states. You have a new leader in Saudi Arabia now that seems to be helping in this regard, and to try to put together a force that could potentially stabilize the expansion of Iranian influence in Iraq, in Syria, and hold on to these lands, these territories in western Iraq and eastern Syria that we've just liberated from ISIS, and prevent ISIS from returning. Now, it is a long shot, and he's got a real problem with Turkey, but he's working on that problem. His instincts are right. Stand behind Israel, worry about Iranian behavior in the region, and otherwise, deal with the problem. The instinct of not putting large American forces in place in the Middle East. I don't think Donald Trump wants to do that. I don't think he's looking for a war. with any of these countries. Oddly enough, his rhetoric in Asia didn't have the consequence of, leading to war with Little Rocket Man. It's actually produced some negotiations. He has an understanding of leverage, certainly through his negotiations as a real estate magnate, that I think is appropriate. By the way, in the world when you're dealing with people like Putin and Xi and the mullahs in Iran and Kim Jong-un in Korea. I would agree with everyone that, I don't like nuclear weapons, I don't like war, I don't like military leverage. We spend too much on the military. But we live in a world where other people don't agree with us on that. They're actually using military force against us. The Russians certainly used it in Syria and complicated the problems for us in Syria. So, you have to at least show that you're willing to stand up for your friends and your allies and for your values before you have any chance of being credible with respect to those values.
Just make sure you charge your friends 2% of GDP in order to stand up for them, because that's what Trump went and said. We'll stand up for you, but you got to give us 2% of GDP, which you committed to do 4 years ago. Yeah, exactly. You absolutely committed. There was commitments to do that, but we're gonna walk away if you don't do that. I don't know. It comes back to the question of what kind of values are being projected then, and the partners that you choose. What does that say? If you're partnering with regimes that are autocratic regimes that suppress human rights on a daily basis and violently, that's a concern. I don't know if that's the leadership that I'd want to be following. So I had to interrupt, sorry.
Tim, anything else on Iran, or you're fine? Did you want to make any comments on Iran or not?
Oh, I think the Iran agreement is absolutely something that we must maintain. One of the terrible things about language is that it can be misused. And the Iran negotiation was called the Iran deal. And I kept saying to John Kerry on any number of occasions, John, stop calling this a deal. It's as if somebody is trying to get away with something, or somebody's cutting a corner or whatever. It was an agreement, and it was a very hard-fought agreement. And it engaged not only the Europeans, but the Chinese and the Russians, who were also engaged in this agreement and in agreement with what happened there. If we decide that we're going to pull out of this, it seems to me, as you're suggesting, we endanger our credibility in many, many different ways. But we also walk ourselves right into the Sunni-Shia problem. Where is there any kind of a check on Iran? What is going to be the check on Iran? One of the ways of getting a check on Iran, if you're interested in getting a check on Iran, is the nuclear agreement. We don't want to get ourselves in a situation where we are allied with the Saudis and the Israelis and that whole side of the Muslim world. We're on one side and one is on the other, and we're not even involved as an honest broker. So it seems to me the Iran deal is exceedingly important. Is it perfect? Of course not. Does it do everything related to Iran? It was never intended to. The critics who say, oh my God, they're still doing X, Y, and Z around the world, well, that they are still doing X, Y, and Z around the world. But the Iran agreement was not intended to take care of every problem. It was focused quite particularly on the development of nuclear weaponry in Iran. And it's the best agreement of that kind that's ever been put together. The final thing I would say is in politics, one of the rules is it's all compared to what? X is compared to what? So that's what I would also ask for the critics to say, compared to what? I think it's got to be stabilized and worked on and enforced, and then we try to figure out where to go from there.
Next question is in the same area of the world. And that's a question from a student on Syria. Kind of what's the next steps? What do you think is the right move for the United States in response to this attack? Who wants to take that one?
All right, so I work with this Dutch organization, and we've had partners in Syria for the last 20 years. And so we've been working to kind of support the building of democratic institutions and things like that. And now our partners are dying, and a lot of our partners are dead. So it's very hard to talk for me to talk about Syria because, when you lose a lot of people that you've come to work with and you really care about, it can be tough. In terms of what is the best thing for the U.S. to do, I have no bloody clue. I'm not going to, I wish there was a magic answer. This is a crisis that has been going on for now. There's a civil war, as it's called, a proxy war by others, that's been going on for years, and hundreds of thousands of people are dead, and hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing. So one good thing that the U.S. could do would be to open its doors to Syrian refugees, to offer some help and support for those who are just trying to live. Okay? Like, that's one little thing, but that's not nearly enough, and it doesn't address the root cause of the problem, it doesn't address the conflict, and it doesn't stop the conflict. And it's very painful, and I wish I had a solution, but I can only suggest a baby step.
Henry, sorry, we keep putting it back to you.
Yeah, I've sort of suggested, I think, what at least Trump is trying to do. I mean, look, there are a number of options in the case of the Middle East, and it seems to me maybe one of the popular ones now, and Trump is aware of that, I think, those are his instincts, is to withdraw, is to simply try to handle it all with diplomacy, while the adversaries, Iran, Russia, use force. Now, the country that is going to really be in peril as a result of that is Israel. I can't imagine an America that somehow or other abandons Israel. So we're going to be involved in this thing one way or the other. I would like to stay involved in a more substantial way. Our chance to really intervene, I think, with some degree of success was missed. That was before the Russians got involved. Now, I'm not in favor of kind of trying to challenge the Russian position there. I'm not in favor of overthrowing Assad. I'm looking for a way in which we can control the territories that we have liberated from ISIS to make sure that the terrorist threat, which is our primary concern in Iraq and in Syria, does not return. If we can do that, we can also perhaps stabilize a bit Iranian influence across those northern countries, Iraq, Syria, and into Lebanon. Maybe preventing a land bridge, which could begin to provide weapons to Hezbollah and to others that are confronting Israel and will use those weapons. They now have over 100,000 of these missiles. They've been flying those missiles in, by the way, with Iranian aircraft. And every now and then you see the Israelis strike back. Well, they're setting up for a major confrontation with Israel. So it just puzzles me. I don't want to use force. I don't like the idea of military. I served in the military. I don't want, but what do you do in a world where other countries are willing to take greater risks? You can withdraw, and that's an option. We can leave the Middle East. I think you're going to be back in in very short order. So I'm just looking for and I think Trump, as I say, has the right instincts on this. I think he deserves your support on that. He says, he said the other day he wanted to leave it to others. Well, we're bringing our troops home. Let's leave it to others. That's a typical kind of withdraw, come home, nationalist response. And I think it's his instinct. It was in Afghanistan as well, by the way. But the military, is telling him, look, you do that, here are the consequences, and later we're going to be faced potentially with another Middle East war. What do we do then? And so I hope he finds some middle ground without having to put large numbers of American forces on the ground. Maybe at some point we can get Arab forces on the ground. And yes, they're going to have to come from the Sunni side. I mean, you're trying to block or check in a traditional sort of balance of power game. You're trying to check a Shia state that's obviously expanding its influence in the region. So unless you want to withdraw, you can't escape that conflict. I don't want American forces there or large numbers, because that puts the bullseye on our back, as it did in Iraq, and nobody's in favor of that. But he's got a tough problem here, and I think he deserves maybe a little more consideration than a lot of us will give him.
My guess is that he is probably going to have to. He's going to have to respond some way militarily. We're too far down that road, and politically, I think the president's going to have some kind of a military response. What follows after that is, of course, the question. I think one of the most important things is to attempt to use this as a way to see if we can somehow, renegotiate our relationship with the Russians. That relationship is so terribly important in so many areas of the world, and maybe no place is this more sensitive, than in Syria. Our capability of doing that right now is obviously eroded, but it seems to me we got to take a deep breath and go back at it, as you do in diplomacy, as you know, and you just got to keep trying and keep working at it and seeing if, in fact, we can make some headway. In the meantime, I expect that we'll have stronger sanctions on Russia as a result of this, and the idea of them, poisoning people in somebody else's backyard is absolutely abhorrent. And letting us know this is not going to be a walk in the park by any means, but it's also a terribly, terribly important relationship. And maybe there's something of a silver lining in what's going on in Syria, is that may force us, into more of a relationship, or really working on a relationship with the Russians.
Thank you. Another question from a student. Given that the current administration has pulled out of trade and climate agreements, TPP in Paris, that has allowed some countries, other countries to come up, such as the rising power of China, to have more influence in these areas of creating international norms. Is that a problem for the United States, and how do we deal with that?
I can speak to the Paris side of this. We spent at the UN Foundation probably a decade setting the table for Paris. I mean, it was a long, very difficult, forever and ever and ever negotiation, but ultimately pretty successful as far as it went. And now the question is, how do you measure this and how do you enforce it? These are very complicated technical questions, related to where are concentrations of carbon coming from, what are other gases that are causing us problems, how do we measure those, where do they come from, and how do we equitably get those to be pushed on a downhill slope. Nobody does that better than the United States, and nobody else in the world, in fact, does that at all. We have the capability, not only some in our government, but mostly in the private sector, and these remarkable consulting firms and technical firms and so on that were being deployed to help to enforce Paris. That's going to be absolutely essential, because even if Trump stays in Paris, it's not going to succeed unless we can demonstrate that, in fact, it has the force of what we've said we want Paris to do. And that's not going to happen without some kind of a clear set of enforcement guidelines, and those are going to have to come from the United States of America. So, there's just a direct line on that. We're not going to get up there and tell people what to do. How do you going to fix your emissions problem and so on. But we are going to be, it seems to me, most important in the position of really being, this massive repository of technical assistance for this extremely difficult and complicated question.
If I could build on that, I just came from a class. I spoke in front of a class full of students earlier, and one of the students asked me a question about how nature abhors a vacuum. So if there's an absence of leadership for one, somebody else is going to step in. And in this situation, I agree that that expertise resides here in the U.S. And there has been, and I think in establishing and setting up the Paris talks, there was an amazing consultation with multiple stakeholders. So multi-stakeholders, so you had the companies and different areas of industry, and I thought that, to me, that was an inspiration for how to move forward, how to address major global problems, especially existential problems, right? It's good to have lots of stakeholders at the table. And in this, I don't know if the U.S. at the federal level is going to fill that vacuum, and I wonder if there is actually sort of a conglomerate approach between those private sector stakeholders and the municipal actors across the U.S. that have committed to staying strong with the Paris Accords. And I think that's a very different style of leadership. It's a little bit decentralized. It still needs a strong voice to bring it together. But I just wonder what the possibilities are.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that is coming together. This fall, Jerry Brown is going to be chairing a meeting in San Francisco, sort of We're Still In, and is the informal title of it. But it's going to include, the state, county, and local governments from all across the country, and regional and local governments from all around the world. It is, in a way, of going around, the formalities of is the U.S. in or out of Paris, but to try to develop a continuum there that says, no matter what the U.S. does in a formal sense at the, at the government level, we're still in, and it's going to continue by the private sector and the public sector. I think it's going to be quite a remarkable gathering, and it's a different kind of governance. It's a really different way of thinking about how we might look at this very complicated international problem.
Yeah, I'm worried a lot more about our Trump's policy, our policy at the current time towards the WTO, toward NAFTA, towards potential TPP in the future. In other words, I'm worried about the trade regime, because if we really mess up the economy, the global economy, you can forget about environmental, or not forget about it, but you're going to have much less focus on environmental concerns and much less money to deal with environmental concerns. I don't like the fact that both Bush and Trump withdrew from something without putting something in its place. And maybe it's too early in Trump's case to know that for sure. He has talked about making some changes in Paris and coming back to the Paris Accords. That is clearly the stance that I hope he's taking with respect to the trade agreements. And his appointment of Larry Kudlow as his chief economic advisor is pretty good proof to me that he's a free trader who's, again, trying to use leverage now in the economic area, trying to use leverage in order to get some needed changes in some of these agreements. We made these agreements years ago, 20 years ago. Changes have occurred. Other countries can now make more concessions. In some of the early trade agreements, there's no question about the fact the United States made most of the concessions. We wanted to help these countries. This was part of this policy I talked about earlier, to help other countries prosper and hopefully become more open and more friendly and maybe more democratic. So we'll have to wait and see. Maybe in the next 6 months we'll find out something about the negotiations with China, which are key to the WTO, and then the negotiations with Mexico and Canada on NAFTA.
I agree with what you say about the need to make these adjustments. I think they're very, very important, and we just have to sort of look at the political scene in the United States to know how sensitive we are to that. One element that has to be much more engaged is who benefits from all of these trade agreements, and really trying to understand how much of the economic benefit has accrued to those who are at the top end of the income scale, not only in the United States, but around the world. And this growing gap exists more and more, and it's been exacerbated by the way in which trade has directly or indirectly been managed. And I think that's got to be one of the elements. I hope that the Democratic Party is involved with getting changes in these trade agreements, but it also has to have a focus on this equity side, or they just simply aren't going to work.
A number of questions I'll summarize and kind of put them into one. Go to the question of the U.S. as the U.S. as a symbol and kind of a beacon for the world. And the questions revolve around statements. Well, for example, the fact that we have a much more robust debate about race. Some of the president's policies on things like transgender in the military, some of the bellicose nature of his Twitter statements. And the questions is, are we hurting we're hurting our credibility and our, not even more than credibility, our status as a symbol for diversity, for a symbol for a lot of things that the democratic values that we stand for, and is that going to hurt our national interests?
Look, it's critical that we succeed with respect to our domestic problems. I mean, as I said from the very beginning, America's been this symbol of free government, and with all the problems that involves. And so we've got to keep working on our domestic issues. I don't think we should be I always hear, I'm old enough now to have heard too many times that, things are worse than they've ever been. No, I lived through the 60s and 70s, and I'm not really sure today is worse than things were in the 60s and 70s. At that time, we were losing credibility around the world because of the civil rights issues and riots that we were having and our Watergate scandals. And so we're faced with some issues of that sort today, no question about it. And I would always give those domestic problems our priority. We need to ensure growth. We need to worry about equity. I agree with that. I probably have other ways of trying to achieve that equity than maybe my Democratic friends. We need to do something about immigration. I think my view is we need to slow it down a little bit. Look, I'm a son of an immigrant. So, and this country is an immigrant country. But we have admitted 59 million immigrants in the last 60 years. Maybe we need a little time to absorb it. So, leave aside for the moment the legal, illegal. I think if you could get some reduction in the numbers, maybe we're allowing 1 million in, reduce it to 500,000 or cut the difference. That's what the Cotton Bill calls for in Congress. Cut it to 750,000. Whatever, just show the concern in this area for some kind of reasonable approach. And then get the economy growing so we can, in fact, absorb over the next 10, 20 years. And the biggest problem there, by the way, is going to be not a tax cut here or a spending initiative there. It's going to be the fiscal deficit, and it's going to be the fiscal debt of this, the national debt of this country. And at some point, we're going to have to come to terms with it. And that's not going to be an easy problem because it's going to hit the entitlement question. And we're going to have to, at some point, deal with that, by the way. If there's something that will tell whether or not we continue to be a symbol of successful self-government, it's going to ultimately be that, area.
There's some things that I really agree with what you're saying here. The looking ahead and how to deal with issues of debt. And any student today is looking ahead and trying to figure out how to deal with the issues of debt. And if you look at U.S. nationally, it's like multiplied. But I don't know about the time issue. And that's something, I think things are way better than they used to be, okay? But we know more about the bad things because of the way we communicate with one another, because we can see instantly on Facebook Live somebody getting shot. And so we know things, and that's not gonna slow down. Technology is not slowing down, it's getting faster. And so I think we have to figure out ways to work with that in terms of moving ahead and looking at what's coming. And I really think it's interesting that this issue of the wealth inequality has come up, because was it The Guardian that released last year the statistic that there are 6 people that control more wealth in the world? 6 people control more wealth than 50% of the people on the planet, like 6 individuals. And that's just not sustainable. That's not going to help us get to dealing with global challenges that are that we have to find ways to get to. So, figuring out how to prevent collapse and how to focus on a little bit on the internal, I think would be really, really cool. Because I made a commitment to my family at home not to travel to places that I could get shot. And so my husband asked me if I was going to stop coming to the US. And I wish I could say that as a joke, but it was this very serious discussion that we had. Because it's scary when you're outside, when you look at what gets reported out. So this issue of what is the image of the US externally, in my home, it's a place where I could get shot. But again, I am privileged. I'm white, I'm tall, so it's not as dangerous for me. But it's still, that's something that is, that we talk about in our office. And we're actually having a discussion about whether to move the US from a safe country list for our travel forms to an unsafe country. And that's an intense thing to look at, because I grew up in New York, man. It's way better than New York in the 80s, but it's still terrifying.
Larry, can I just add one note that we've not talked about, but I think it's going to be much, much more important in the coming months, and that is the management of the internet and privacy. I think the demand in the United States, I've been really astounded by the response in the Congress to the privacy issues and what's going on at Facebook. I mean, this was, you know, there's some posturing that goes on, but a lot of this is very, very real concern, reflecting also constituents. And are we going to get to a point where we're going to do what the Europeans have done, which is to allow individuals to control their own information, and that they have to be told if their information is being used, and they have to be given the means so that they can manage and control their own information. That's totally different from the model that we currently have, but it seems to me is going to be, you know, a very, very important issue for how we think politically, how we think economically. You know, the internet's taken over everything, and there is going to be the internet of the internet too, which we're going to have to watch. So.
Great. We unfortunately have run out of time. Thank you very much for your questions. I apologize for the questions you weren't. Please join me in thanking Susie, Henry, and Tim. Thank you.